Welcome to Essential Dynamics. We're back for season 5. I'm your host, Derek Hudson. I've been developing Essential Dynamics as a way to help us think about systems and about the things we try and do as human beings. And I am very excited today to have Dr. Ann Hall on the podcast. Ann, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, I'm very pleased to be here. I love talking about our subject.
Okay, so I'm just going to introduce our subject and our speaker very quickly. Ann Hall is an emeritus professor at the University of Alberta, and she's, among other things, has studied the sociology of sports, particularly women's sports. And it is so fantastic that you took upon yourself the job a number of years ago to write about the Edmonton Grads. And so I found Ann through her book, The Grads Are Playing Tonight. The Edmonton Grads were a women's basketball team that was very dominant. And we're going to start with Ann explaining just how absolutely amazing they were. And then we're going to go from that to how we can learn about systems from the system that the Grads created over many years. So Ann, welcome. You are excited.
Yes, thanks, Derek. We need to go back all the way to 1912 when Commercial High School was set up in the what was then the John A. McDougall public school. It existed in the top floor of that, and that the public school still exists today on north of 109th Avenue on 107th Street. And Percy Page was a young teacher from Ontario. And in 1912, he arrived in Edmonton to establish business and secretarial education in the Edmonton public school system. And this was at Commercial. Now, he also taught PE, or physical education, and he introduced basketball to the school. And of course, since it was a commercial school, most of the students, there were a few men, but most of the students were women. And they enjoyed playing basketball. It was a relatively new sport for women at the time. And after some of the original players graduated, they wanted to continue playing in the new city league. And so this is in 1915, the Edmonton Commercial Graduates Basketball Club was formed. Now, the team, right from the beginning, did very well. They won city championships, they won provincial championships, and they then in 1922 they traveled for the first time outside the province, and they traveled to London, Ontario, and they beat the London Shamrocks, which was the very first Dominion Championships. Now, it wasn't really across the whole country, but it was called the Dominion Championships.
And let me just stop
Sure.
you there for a couple of things. So the Dominion Championships, the Dominion was the word that was used way more frequently back then.
Yes, it was. Yeah, wasn't called Canadians. Yeah, it was called Dominion.
all of Canada, and and here we are in early 2025. We have different ways of thinking about Canada. Maybe we should bring Dominion back again.
Yeah, it might be a good idea.
And I just want to back up on a couple other things. So when was basketball invented?
It was invented. Let me see. It was the latter part of the 19th century, so 1892, around there. I have to look that up myself.
Yeah, and I thought
James
I had
Naismith. Yeah, invented the game. Yeah,
James Naismith, who's Canadian.
Yes, from Harvard.
And he was in Springfield, Massachusetts. Is that right?
Yeah, Springfield College, and he wanted to invent a game that was an indoor game. He was teaching men and boys, of course, and he wanted to invent a game that would be played indoors, that was challenging, and so on. And the story is, of course, that the first basket was really a peach basket of some kind that he hooked up on a pole, and they had these balls that were sort of basketballs. And no, the basketball was invented by a Canadian. Yep.
So it wasn't that old in 1915 when the Grads started playing
Absolutely
ball.
not. It was a relatively new game, and but it was a game that was attracted to women and to girls. Of course, at that time, it wasn't a very, it was quite a stationary game. I mean, I'm of the generation. I played for Queens way back in the early '60s, and we were still playing women's rules. And women's rules at that time were that you could only go two-thirds of the court. I played guard so that I didn't shoot, and I could only go two-thirds of the court. And then we eventually got in a roving player rule where and I was also could shoot, so I was a roving player. So I was the only player on the team that could go back and forth. And so
So that's the way you played. I thought that ended in like the 30s or 40s or
no,
something.
no,
Oh,
I played for Queens from 1960 to 64, and we were still playing women's rules.
my goodness. So what do you think of the NCAA women's tournament now?
I think it's fantastic. I mean, my lifetime is such that I've watched this whole game emerge into, into something that was, you wouldn't have recognized the kind of basketball that we played.
I did watch some video and I didn't find very much of the grads, and they were playing the men's game, I think, in the video.
Yes, they did. Women's rules were sort of in vogue. I mean, you must remember this is very early, and Percy Page decided very early on that they would always play what were then called men's rules. But they were still a kind of a it looked fast moving, but compared to today's basketball, it wasn't because there was a fair amount of stop and start, stop and start.
So I just wanted to set that context. So basketball was new. Edmonton was new.
Yes, Edmonton at that time probably had had about a population of about 14,000, 17,000. Wasn't very big. No.
It wasn't very big, and this commercial high school was teaching primarily women typing, stenography, accounting, stuff like that.
That's correct. They were educating young women. There were some men in the program too, but they were educating them to go into the businesses in Edmonton and be secretaries, clerks, whatever. And that was the role of the program. It was a 2-year program, and they would go right in immediately into the workforce.
So they left playing high school ball, and then they carried on into the city league after.
Well, there was a city league, but most importantly, were the American teams that came up. You see, you have to remember that we had also the Edmonton Stock Pavilion, which was, I think, built in 1913. And the Edmonton Stock Pavilion, which became known as the Edmonton Arena, where it was placed and was this huge, ugly building that literally was a stock pavilion. It's where the Edmonton Expo Center is now.
Right, right.
And my view is that if we had not had that building, which got converted into a hockey arena in the wintertime, but it also was what they did was to put a wooden floor down there. And so this meant that they had a venue to attract American teams to come up and play in Edmonton. And to me, this is how the team actually made its name in those early days, because they played for the Underwood Trophy. And from 1923, 30 different American teams came to Edmonton to challenge the Grads, and some more than once. And these were what were called industrial teams in the United States. So they were part of factories. The Cleveland Favorite Knits, for example, the Chicago Brownies, the Chicago Trunks, and these were the teams that came up and played. And I think were what made the team a better team and also gave it a huge reputation in North America.
So they went, I think I interrupted you earlier, they went to London and won the first Dominion Championship.
Yes, they did way back in 22. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that put them on the map for traveling American teams.
Well, Basketball in Canada for women's basketball really, hadn't grown very much.
Right.
And I think that Paige saw the opportunity to bring these American teams up, who had been playing a little bit longer. They were better, more organized, and it's funny, they always thought that they could beat the grads, which they couldn't. So they would travel up and they would sometimes put a few ringers in that they, players that they thought would be helpful because they picked them up along the way, and it never worked because
Never worked.
they got beaten constantly.
So the grads would enter, people would come, I assume they travel by train for the most
Mostly by
part.
train, yes.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And they would come up and then they would get beaten in the Edmonton Stock Pavilion,
Yeah,
sometimes
mostly
badly.
they did, yes. Uh-huh. And they were huge, exciting games. They were, as I said, the Stock Pavilion would have about 4,000, 6,000 spectators in it. And when you compare it, as I said before, to the size of Edmonton, that's huge. That's almost, a third of the population of Edmonton coming to watch
Coming
these
to watch
games.
watch the
Yeah,
games.
yeah.
So that was huge. And we have to remember that there was no television back then,
No television and no radio.
no radio even.
No,
So
no.
so they were
The games originally were not, well, were not
yeah,
on radio at all. No,
right. So they were live and that was where the action was.
that's exactly right. Yeah, yeah.
And as I understand it, the hockey team that played at the time was the Edmonton Eskimos.
Yes, yeah,
So that's confusing to us young people.
yeah.
Okay, so tell me a little bit more about how dominant the grads were and what that looked like over the years.
Well, this team was very dominant, and Page had to seek elsewhere really for competition. And basketball was growing in Europe and in England, and he wanted to take part in that. So it's often thought that the grads competed in the Olympics. And this is not true, but there is a story behind that, in that the Olympics began, and basketball was not, as I said, part of it. So women's basketball. But Percy Page decided that he would take the team over to Europe at the same time as the Olympics. And I believe that what he was trying to do was to lobby the Olympic officials to bring women's basketball into the Olympics. But they first traveled in 1924, and when the Paris Olympics were on in Paris, and they played local teams around in Europe, but around in France. And of course, they had been playing so much longer than these European teams. They were actually, even though they were quite small in size compared to today's teams, they demolished these teams. And if you look at the scores, they're, for example, in the Paris 24 2, they're 64 to 16, 65 to 12. They were so much better than these European teams. But it gave Page an opportunity to lobby the officials, the Olympic officials, to bring women's basketball into the Olympics. Of course, this didn't happen until 1976. And so they went to the 24 Olympics, they went to the 28 Olympics, and again played local teams. They went to the 32 Olympics in Los Angeles, and as far as I can tell, they didn't play any games at all. They were just there watching the games. And then in 36 at the Olympics in Berlin, they were actually part of the Canadian team in the sense that they were given the Canadian blazers to wear, and they were invited to participate in the opening ceremonies, the march in of the athletes. But that didn't happen because they were in London, England, actually playing a team there, and they didn't get there in time. So many people say that, and I've seen it, and for example, at the Saville Center, the display shows them as being at the Olympics, and they never competed at the Olympics because there was no women's basketball for them to compete in. But my feeling was that Page would saw this as an opportunity always when the Olympics came around for him to lobby for women's basketball to be part of the Olympics, which he didn't see in his lifetime, actually.
Didn't see in his lifetime. So um, I'm still trying to get my head around dressing in a Canadian blazer, being invited to march as athletes, as a functioning sports team for an event that wasn't going to happen.
Right. Hmm.
So was that because of the respect that the Canadian sporting establishment had for the grads, or
I think it
what's going
was, and
on?
I think it was that by the time, this is the third time Page had taken his team to Europe. He knew some of the Olympic officials. He knew the Canadian athletic officials. I mean, he was extremely well respected in that world, and so I think everyone felt badly, really, that there wasn't women's basketball in the Olympics, and so this was a kind of way to not placate them, but also just to give them the credit that they really deserved, because there was no question, they were the top basketball team virtually in the world.
And were they undefeated in Europe for those various trips that they did?
Absolutely. Again, if you look at the scores, the 30, the sorry, where they played the London Pioneers, for example, and they beat them 100-2. I mean, no one could touch them. I don't think in all the time that they were in Europe in all those years, they never lost a game.
So that 100-2 score, I want to pick up something that I read in the book, and I think in our next episode we'll talk a little bit more about the coaching philosophy and things like that. But my understanding was that Coach Page always wanted his team doing their best,
Oh,
and
without exception, yes, yes.
and they were there to show the world how basketball was played. And so if they could score 100 points, they would score 100 points. They were going to let up once they had a lead.
Absolutely not. No, no, no. That didn't matter. I mean, the scores were always lopsided, and coach, he was always determined that whenever they went on the court, they played the very best they could, and they showed whoever was in the audience at the time how basketball could be played.
So, and do you have more notes that you need to complete the story arc here? Because I have tons of questions, but I don't want to
Well, I think,
mix us up here.
yeah, I think the important thing is that the the Edmonton became basically because of these trips and because of their reputation and because of their success. At this time, Edmonton became the Edmonton of the Grads. I mean, over my lifetime, I traveled a lot and traveled to Europe. And sometimes when I go and always within a sporting context, usually or a conference or whatever, people today in Europe still have heard of the Grads. They know about them, and because the history is there. And when the Grads returned, always from any of these trips, the welcome that they got at the train station. I mean, I'm looking at a picture now. It's just unbelievable sea of people who welcomed them home from these trips always. And the individual Grads, when I wrote the book, for example, what I wanted to do was to try to bring to life the lives of the 38 players who were on the team over the years from let's say from 1915 through to 19 in 42, I think. And so everyone realized who these women were, and they were like really sports stars within the city because people knew them, and they were usually, because they had the secretarial training and so on, businesses loved to employ them. And when they were employed, the businesses were always very careful to make sure that they gave them the time needed to travel for the exhibition games or travel to the U.S. because the team would barnstorm down almost every summer. The team would go down into the United States barnstorming and playing local teams in the States. So the business community in Edmonton welcomed them and supported them. The Rotarians, for example, were enormous supporters of the grads. And it's so interesting because we really don't have that kind of connection today. I don't think there's a team or individual members of the team where we really have that sort of community and connection.
Oh, there's so much to that. So one question I have is that the the players, okay, so they're amateurs, so they had jobs and
Yes,
was
yes,
and they played for fun. They played. Why did they
basically,
play?
yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
They played. They wanted to be on that team. I suppose the other thing, and I did read in your book, is that they it gave them an opportunity to travel.
Absolutely. And I mean, you're talking primarily about working class women
Sure.
who would not have had any of these kinds of opportunities. And when they traveled in Europe, Mrs. Page always went with them. And she herself was a very cultured woman. She spoke fluent French. The Pages always made certain that when they were traveling in Europe, they had cultural activities. They learned about the countries. It was a very enriching experience for all these women.
That's fantastic. Um, so let's go back. As yeah, the other question I wanted to ask was, so Edmonton was on the map in Europe because of the grads.
Yes.
And certainly in basketball places like I know they played a lot of teams from Chicago and the Midwest that they would refer to Edmonton. You said Edmonton of the grads.
Yes, it was clearly Edmonton of the Grads.
A third of the city would show out to the big games, just come to the big games,
In
and
the
then
early days, yes,
yeah,
yes. It began to slip a little bit. Radio comes in, the Grads games are broadcast on radio, so you begin to see fewer people coming out to
hmm
the actual games at the arena. But the support for them was no different. I mean, people would be excited that the game would be on radio and they would listen to it and they would cheer on and so on at home. But radio did have an impact on those who went to the arena.
sure. And I'm trying to put myself in that era. So my grandparents would have been children when the grads started and had children like when the grads wound up in the 40s. And my parents would have been in
1940, they finished. Yeah.
my parents would have been in early elementary school then. So it's my grandparents' era. I'm trying to get my head around, and I don't have that. But was it a big deal? Was it a non-issue, or what was? Tell me about the fact that the grads were a women's team. Was that a thing, or was that just they were just a basketball team?
No, that's a very interesting question because they it didn't really matter. I mean, I think if it had been a men's team, it would have been, I mean, the same thing. The fact that I think the fact that they were a women's team, of course, was a little bit unique, but at the same time, it was the fact that these women were also so much involved within the community itself because people knew them. They could see them they could maybe encounter them when they went to a store, or they knew who they were. And Page, of course, made absolutely certain that their behavior at all times was up to standards that he didn't counter anything that was unusual or not appropriate. So they were upstanding citizens, if you like,
In every
within the
way, yeah,
community. In every way, yes.
yeah,
Mhm.
that's fantastic. Uh, so I was for a number of years worked at Edmonton's Economic Development Agency, and we and the successor organization Explore Edmonton still promotes Edmonton in any way it can to the world. And I just want to sort of highlight the impact that the grads would have had for so long on getting people to travel to the community and understand what was going on here. and also just to highlight the sense of community spirit and accomplishment that they must have shared with the community for all those years.
Yes, I think the latter is probably the most important lesson you can learn from the grads in this particular time period.
Can you say more about that?
Um, it's they were just so well known, and I had the opportunity when I decided to write the book. Most of the grads had died, and and I did interview four of them altogether. And one was in Edmonton, and they were spread across the country, so I had to travel a little bit. And speaking to them, and all of them had been in the latter part because they were still alive. They had experienced something that I think hardly anyone involved in women's athletics experiences, because they were so much a part of being in a community that supported them and knew them, and was always interested in who they were. One of the ones I interviewed lived, and I was at her 100th birthday party. You know,
Cool.
and she was still known as a grad. She was still recognized as a grad, and she was 100 years over 100 years old. So, and I think part of it had to do with Percy Page's idea about how people should behave. And whether there were men or women, it didn't really matter, because he was a very honorable man. He always made sure that the players under him behaved in a way that he thought was appropriate. He was stern in some ways. Some people, when I started to work on the book, some people say, "Oh, you're going to find Mr. Page as a kind of a dictator." That was not true at all. He was an exemplar, and he demanded of the grads that they, certainly when they were in public, that they behaved properly, they dressed properly. When they were in Europe, of course, they were representatives of the country, and he made sure that there was never any controversy around the grads that I could find.
Well, that's awesome. So we're up on time for round one here, and I told you it would go fast. And so I want to stop it here with that concept of the grads being examples and the coach being an exemplar in the community and the sense of community. We're going to pick it up next time and talk about what we can learn from the grad experience. And so for our podcast listeners, wait a couple of weeks and you'll get the rest of the story, and it'll be awesome. But for now, Anne, thank you very much for being with us. And Bryn Griffiths, thanks for making us sound so good. Until next time, consider your quest.